Welcome back to our final scene in Act 3 of Deconstructing Directing with Kindness. I'm Andrew Robler, founder and archivist here, and in this scene, we're diving into one of the more challenging areas of directing, especially for those of us who learned how to direct on the job. How we approach emotionally charged material with integrity, specificity, and of course, reckless kindness. If you've made your way through Acts 1, 2, and 3 here at Deconstructing Directing, then you already know directing isn't just about blocking and notes, it's about people. It's about trust. And there's no greater test of that trust than when what's on the page connects to someone's lived experience of trauma, identity, oppression, or grief. In those moments, the stakes are high, not just artistically, but emotionally and ethically. This scene is an introduction about how to navigate those moments without avoiding them, without causing harm, and without losing the power that charged material can carry. So first, let's get specific and define what we mean by charged material. Your mind may immediately jump to onstage intimacy, ranging from a peck on the lips to full-on simulated sexual intercourse. Or maybe your mind jumps to fight choreography, which brings with it an increased risk of physical injury to actors. And while those are definitely two types of charged material, there are many more. When I talk about charged material, I'm talking about anything that carries personal emotional weight for the people in the room or brings with it an increased risk of injury. So some examples might include scenes of sexual violence, abuse, or assault, even if it's just discussed. Racist, homophobic, transphobic, or ableist language. Depictions of suicide, addiction, or self-harm. Stories about grief, religious trauma, or war, and moments that ask for deep emotional exposure or vulnerability. It's also important to recognize that charged material is by definition personal, and like anything that's personal, it can vary, sometimes wildly, from person to person. What's neutral to one person can be deeply charged for another. So just asking, is this content sensitive, isn't enough. We have to ask, what does this content mean in this room with these people right now? Ideally, approaching charged material in a recklessly kind way starts before the first rehearsal, before auditions, before you choose your team, and frankly, before you even select a play. Of course, things are rarely ever ideal in theater, especially in upstream spaces, so it's okay if you find yourself mid-process and realizing that you need to change your approach. The tools we're going to discuss can be introduced at any time. You'll just get the most benefit from them if you start early. That said, let's start by acknowledging that there's a reason we're having this conversation at all. Charged material often makes for incredibly meaningful and compelling stories. The marketing world tells us that sex sells, of course, in part because it feels taboo, and in part because moments of intimacy are deeply compelling. Additionally, as artists, we are often drawn to stories of struggle and pain because they feel uniquely human, and humanity is compelling. There's nothing inherently wrong with telling these stories. What matters is that we recognize the unique challenge that charged material presents and take the steps to tell these stories in a way that balances kindness towards the artist, ourselves, and our audiences. The first tool is one that ideally we use while we are deciding whether to direct a particular piece: a content audit. In Act 2, Scene 5, we explored understanding our personal artistic taste, and this is not dissimilar. We have a full worksheet in the usual spot, but some examples of questions you might ask while auditing a potential project are: what attracts me to this story? What identities are explicitly represented? What identities could be represented but are not explicitly? Who holds the most power in the story? How do they wield it? How would representation of power in this way impact your community? Back in Act 3, Scene 5, we talked about the importance of keeping the representation of disability in mind when examining a script, even and perhaps especially when the story is not specifically about disability. This is an example of non-explicit identities that could be present in the story. If they were to be, how would that impact the story? Now, if the identities represented in the story are not ones you share, it's also important to ask the perspective of at least one person who does share those identities. Just keep in mind that one person cannot speak for a whole community. If you're realizing that you wish you had done this sooner in your process, it's not too late. Take time now, wherever in the process you are, to pause and consider these questions. You might even invite the cast and production team to consider it as well. Taking time for intentional consideration of charged material is always worth it, even when it feels like it's taking away from rehearsal time. The second tool is one that challenges a lot of experienced directors because as a practice, it is very new. Recruiting an intimacy director or mental health coordinator and/or fight choreographer. Because two of these roles are so new to a lot of directors, we're going to spend a little bit of time breaking down what these roles are generally understood to be, why they are not only important but valuable to our work as directors, and some introductory thoughts and tips about best practices. We'll likely have a full scene, if not a full act, purely about working with intimacy and fight directors in the future, so this is just an introduction. First, let's talk about the roles themselves. In the world of theater, we generally refer to intimacy professionals as intimacy directors, while in the film and TV world, you'll hear them referred to as intimacy coordinators more commonly. While the work done by intimacy professionals has been around for quite some time, the term intimacy choreography was coined in 2006, and the field rapidly expanded in 2017 with the resurgence of the Me Too movement. Since that time, it has become standard practice to hire an intimacy professional in most downstream theater spaces and union film or TV projects. Unions like Equity and SAG-AFTRA both now have requirements in place to ensure their involvement. It's becoming increasingly common in upstream theater spaces to hire an intimacy professional, but due to budgetary constraints and lack of exposure or training for directors in many places, it's still not the norm. Generally speaking, the role of an intimacy director is to serve as an advocate for actors and other artists in the space when it comes to staged intimacy. As we talked about in Act 2, Scene 6, Making Peace with Power, the reality is that there is always a power dynamic at play in a rehearsal room, even in the healthiest of environments. Artists are trained to say yes to directors, and there are enough stories about actors who are deemed difficult to work with that many actors will push down their discomfort rather than speak up. By bringing in another person whose job is to be an advocate for those who might feel that way, we communicate to our team that their well-being and safety is important enough for us that we are willing to give up some of our directorial power. Because intimacy professionals are advocates for consent-based practices, theatrical intimacy education recently expanded the definition of intimacy, quote, beyond sex, to include leveraging an artist's characteristics to stage heightened race, gender, pregnancy, disability, religion, national origin, or age-related content. If you'll notice, this aligns pretty well with our definition of charged material. And we'll come back to intimacy directors shortly, but let's pivot and talk about mental health coordinators. The Association of Mental Health Coordinators was founded by Bridget McCarthy and Amanda Edwards in 2021 in an attempt to formalize training in tools and practices related to mental health. As their website states, specializing in recorded performance, TV and film, and live performance, theater, dance, and music, mental health coordinators partner with artists and producing organizations of all sizes to equip their spaces with best practices and tools to support their work. I tend to think of it like this. Intimacy professionals are there to help ensure advocacy for the artists in the room while providing tools and artistic guidance to realize certain moments of the story. Mental health coordinators, on the other hand, may fill the first two roles, especially for charged material that may not be sexual or romantic in nature, and serve as a resource to support artists who experience mental health challenges during a production. Finally, the most well-known role in this trio is the fight director, sometimes referred to as the fight choreographer. Their role is a bit more straightforward, but no less important or consent-based. They advocate for safety and efficacy of staged violence, whether that violence involves weapons or not. If two actors have to believably appear to be causing one another physical harm, it's likely that a fight director needs to be involved. An important thing to remember about this trio of consent-based practice roles is that none of them are purely about the actors. After all, stage management, crew, designers, and anyone else present in the room can be impacted by charged material. The stage manager might not be the one being asked to be naked on stage, for instance, but they have to see that nude actor on stage every night, and they don't necessarily have the freedom to just close their eyes like an audience member might. Charged material can impact the mental health of anyone involved in the story, including us as the director. And stage violence and prop weapon safety impacts every artist on stage and the audience as well. So before we talk about best practices, I want to address the number one concern that I hear about working with this trio of professionals, especially intimacy directors. And that is the creative control that many of us feel we are giving up when we bring in someone else to help craft our intimate moments. I say we because in 2017, as the field of intimacy direction was expanding rapidly, my initial response was to say, I've been doing this work since 2012. I'm good at creating spaces where actors feel safe. I don't know why they're saying that I need to bring in someone else. I'm sure many other directors felt or feel the same way. But as I began to learn more about power and power dynamics in my directorial work, check out Act 2, Scene 6, Making Peace with Power, I realized that given the historical norms in theater and the fact that every artist I work with will have worked and will continue to work with other directors, I would never be able to break down those power dynamics entirely. There would always be a sense of pressure on the artists I work with to make me happy. Here's the thing. The best intimacy directors, fight choreographers, and mental health coordinators are not there to make our life more difficult as directors. They are partners who want to help you realize the vision that you and hopefully your team have identified for the production in the same way that a designer or a stage manager might. But just like any of those roles, clearly defining the division of responsibilities and how you will work together is essential to effective collaboration. The sooner we engage with them in the process, the more effective they can be at helping support the overall goals of the production. It's worth noting that there are several types of certification for all three of the roles we've mentioned, but especially in upstream spaces, it's important to acknowledge that certification takes a large amount of time and financial resources that not everyone has. There are plenty of certified folks that I would never work with, and plenty of non-certified folks that I have worked with and will work with as a director. What's important to me isn't the certification of my chosen collaborators, but their familiarity with best practices and safety tools, as well as their ability to contribute to a recklessly kind environment. That said, it is important to vet your collaborators in this area and to work closely with them, especially the first time you work together. If you notice behaviors or practices that feel unsafe or out of place, trust your gut and have a conversation with them about your concerns. We'll cover more about all of this at a later time, but hopefully this gives you a sense of the basics to guide your work in the meantime. The third tool we're going to explore is related to auditions, and that is including clear content warnings in all audition materials. Even with published shows that artists might be familiar with, they may not know how you are planning to approach certain elements, or they may have forgotten elements or lines or situations that are included in the show. And remember, it's not only about the people playing the characters in those situations. Anyone who might witness it in rehearsal or performance deserves the opportunity to opt out of the process before they feel like they don't have the option to do so. This can be as simple as listing the required intimacy moments in the show, such as Romeo, male, 16 to 25, handsome, intelligent, and sensitive. Though impulsive and immature, his idealism and passion make him an extremely likable character. Intimacy requirements. Multiple kisses with Juliet, partial nudity, torso and upper buttocks. Fight requirements, swords and unarmed combat. It may also be helpful to list general topics that might be charged for members of the cast and crew in audition announcements so that they aren't surprised. Generally, when I hear pushback against this idea of being transparent about these needs, it's usually centered around the idea of either A, it being too much work for the director or something that the director hasn't thought about or decided yet, or B, frustration that, hey, I never needed this kind of warning. Why are people today so sensitive? So let's address both of these head on. First, it is absolutely more work for the director, and it absolutely does mean that the director needs to think about these things earlier than they might normally. That's not a bad thing. The more work that we do upfront as directors to be specific and transparent about our approach to a show, the more effectively the artists who we are recruiting to work with us can judge their interests in this particular production. If you've ever had actors arguing with you about the meaning of a line or designers who leave the production because they realized that this wasn't what they thought they signed up for, then you know that lack of specificity and transparency makes far more work for us down the road. And if we're not entirely sure about what the needs will be, then we can be clear about that as well and offer any thoughts we do have about how we think that this might go. Second, we need to talk about survivorship bias. This is when we assume that because we survived something, everyone else can, should, and/or will survive it as well. It's very true that for many of us, intimacy and charged material on stage was and perhaps is still just part of the gig. It's easy to get frustrated at these new tools and approaches because it feels like we are being expected to do work that was not expected of others, and we feel like the old way worked just fine. The crucial thing we need to understand is that for every one of us who has been okay with the old way of approaching this, there are likely dozens, if not hundreds, of folks who were not okay. So many people walk away from theater every year because of unkind practices that are justified because, that's the way it's always been. The Me Too movement highlighted a large number of them, but they are still happening, and there are many, many people for whom speaking up feels like a risk. If we are directing with kindness, we cannot give in to survivorship bias. The idea that you need to crack a few eggs to make an omelet is a lie because human beings are not eggs. Harm is not necessary for artistic success, and anyone who tells you that it is only says that because they don't want to examine their own behavior and acknowledge that they have caused and will continue to cause harm. All right, beyond notices in the casting and production information, once the process begins, we can work together with our cast and crew to create shared values for how you'll work together. Check out Act 1, Scene 2 for more discussion about community agreements and some worksheets there. One final thought before we move on to talking about consent. Be careful with the word safe when it comes to theater. Often we have the best of intentions when saying that we want theater to be a safe space for the artists we work with. But the reality is that there's a lot of risk in what we do, and more importantly, there's a lot of discomfort. But discomfort and danger or harm are not the same things. Think about working out. If we are completely comfortable, we're not pushing our body or encouraging our muscles to grow. In the same way as artists, if we are serious about pushing ourselves to improve our artistic excellence, we are often going to be uncomfortable, uncertain, and maybe even a little scared. That's normal. So instead of safe space, I like the term brave space. Theater is a space where we create room for each other to be brave in trying new things, exploring who we are as people and as artists, and grow through that bravery. But bravery does not need to be okay with actual danger or harm, and reckless kindness requires that we check in regularly and work to ensure that people have tools to express their boundaries and concerns clearly and easily. All right, let's move on to talking about consent, because while the concept has gained a lot of traction when it comes to romantic and sexual relationships, the reality is that consent matters immensely in all interpersonal relationships, and especially in the context of risky, charged work like we often do in theater. Chelsea Pace and theatrical intimacy educators define consent as being contextual, conditional, revocable, and freely given. Contextual means that consent does not carry across to all people or all moments. So just because an actor is comfortable with physical contact in one scene with one actor, I can't assume as the director that they are automatically comfortable with physical contact in all scenes and with all other actors. Conditional means that consent is not a blanket statement. Individuals can give partial consent, and framing it as all or nothing is problematic. For instance, an actor may be comfortable with contact on one part of their body, but not all. Revocable means that if at any point your boundaries change for any reason, you can revoke your consent. This is the hardest for directors to accept, I think, because it means that sometimes we may have to make changes late into a process or even a production run if an actor becomes uncomfortable with something. This can feel frustrating, like the person involved in the process lied to us, but the reality is, given the culture putting so much pressure on actors to say yes and not complain, someone coming to us to share something that they are not comfortable with is actually a huge honor. And it doesn't mean that we have to abandon the artistic discoveries that we made. Oftentimes, we can make adjustments or add additional support in a way that helps the individual to feel comfortable enough to continue. And it's true that sometimes it may mean that an understudy or replacement may need to step in and take over if the role requires the elements where consent has been revoked. When that happens, though, we need to be clear that it isn't punitive and that we aren't going to punish or speak badly about the individual who revoked their consent, or else we will contribute to the same culture that makes artists so scared to speak up in the first place. Finally, freely given means that consent is not taken, it is given without reservation. In Act 2, Scene 6, we talk about power dynamics and the way that we navigate them as directors. Coercive power, which is where we use punishments to deter behavior or aggressive tactics to ensure compliance, is the polar opposite of freely given consent. If someone fears losing their job or role if they don't consent or continue to consent, then their consent is not freely given. It is coerced. So, how can we help to ensure that our teams understand that this is how we want to approach consent? By talking about it openly, honestly, and regularly. We can implement check-ins before and after emotionally intense scenes, use opt-in language like, hey, are you okay to run this today? And give them permission to pause without explanation. We can also model and offer clear languages for boundaries like, I'm not available for that version, or can we find a different way? When someone does express their concerns, we don't need to have all the answers in the moment, but we do need to create space to listen. Phrases like, thank you for telling me. Can you share more about what's coming up for you? Or would it help to talk through the intention behind this scene? We can look at some options together. Are powerful in affirming their concern and our willingness to work it through with them. Now, if the harm is coming from the script and can't be worked around, don't pretend it's not a big deal. Invite a conversation and be honest about what's possible. We are not their therapist, but we are their leader. And as their leader, we are responsible for caring for them and their well-being. We can still be ambitious, specific, and rigorous in our artistic goals while holding that care. Those things are not in opposition. So let's close by talking about our own relationship to charged material as directors. Sometimes we choose a project because the material reflects part of our own lived experience, including trauma, marginalization, loss, or survival. This can be incredibly powerful, but we are still the one with the most authority in the room, meaning that any disclosure can feel like pressure, even if we don't mean it to. Reckless kindness here means transparency without demand. We might say something like, hey, this play means a lot to me personally. I won't ask anyone to share anything they're not comfortable with, and I'm committed to holding this space with care. If we do choose to share our experience, do it after the trust has been built, not as a shortcut to creating trust, and try to frame it as context, not justification. This can be hard because when someone pushes back about a topic or approach that feels personal to us, it can feel like they are questioning our very sense of self. Justifying a choice because of how it feels to you can feel like you are dismissing the experience of the other artist with a concern. So, if we choose to share our personal experience as part of a conversation about discomfort or concern, making sure that we are clear that we are simply sharing the context for our choice can be important. Like we talked about at the beginning, charged material is common in theater for a reason. It can be deeply healing. When we handle it and the people telling it with care, we can create catharsis, challenge assumption, invite empathy, offer representation, and foster solidarity. But it doesn't happen by accident. It happens when we are intentional about leading with reckless kindness. As we close this act, I want to acknowledge that directing with reckless kindness can be hard. It's messy, complex, and we will absolutely make mistakes. But I hope that across these 8 scenes, you've found new tools, new language, and new frameworks for approaching your work, not just with specificity, but with kindness. Being a director is not about being the smartest person in the room. It's about creating the kind of room where people can do brave, generous, collaborative work. Reckless kindness isn't a detour from the art. It's the way in. As always, everything in our library at Deconstructing Directing is 100% free to access. If you'd like to support the work and help keep Deconstructing Directing open access, please consider joining our Patreon. And if that's not doable for you, don't worry, this work is for you either way. Thank you for walking through this act with me. If it's resonated, please share it with others. We need more directors committed to leading with both vision and kindness. So until next time, stay curious, stay courageous, and be recklessly kind.